first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and vision on his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. And in the dream, we see Daniel having now dreams of animals, big animals. So first there was the statue, and then it's the animals. The first one being a lion, verse 4. The second one being a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. The third one being, verse 6, it's a leopard with 4 heads. And then the last one, verse 7, is a terrible beast. You can't even give it a name. It's dreadful and terrible. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, again, I told you that the book of Daniel is beautiful because it has its own interpretation. And as you continue to read, there is a bit of an interlude between those verses, from verse 9 to verse 14. And you pass from one earthly scene to an heavenly scene. This is what's happening on the earth. And then Daniel has another vision where he sees something happening in heaven. And at the time of that beast, where the little horn comes out, it looks like Daniel is having a vision of the heavenly, because he sees the Ancient of Days, and he sees the Son of God coming to the Ancient of Days as it is described here. And he comes, and we're told in verse 10 that the judgment was set and the book were opened. And people, I have heard comments of people who say that this does not happen under the little horn, but I don't know how they read their Bible, because it says very clearly that Daniel definitely heard and saw that this was under the beast of the little horn here. So when we continue to read this, you will see that Daniel now received an interpretation, and you will see that Daniel gives us precisely what this is all about. So as you see let's go to verse, I'm going to read for you verse 11. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great word, which the horn spake. That horn is the same horn that is described, go to verse 8, is the same horn that came out of the beast, and that horn spake. And I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their life was prolonged for a season and time. And then he sees the Son of Man. So for a minute here, I want to show you something very fascinating. If you see the gold and the silver and the brass and the iron and the clay, you see that these dominions are coming down in value. Gold being more valuable than silver, than brass, than iron and clay. But interestingly enough, these animals, these represent their value, their power and value, but this represents their character. A lion, a bear, a leopard, and a terrible and dreadful animals. Which one would you like to meet? Would you like to meet a lion, a bear, a leopard, or that dreadful animal? These represent the increase in their character. They become more and more powerful, more and more dreadful, and this is what we're going to have to face in the last days. I believe that dreadful and terrible animals is a composite of previous power, which now unite together and attempt to destroy God's people. Now, as I continue here with Daniel, and I told you Daniel interpreted itself, so don't try to find some big interpretation. It says simply here, read with me, verse 17. These great beasts which are 4 kings which shall arise out of the earth. So a beast is a king. And a king in the time of the monarchy was a type of governance. It was a government. Now you would say a prime minister or a president of a republic, but this is nevertheless to show a government. So now you have the 4 beasts which represent 4 kings, and Daniel explains what they are with their medal, and then he brings it to the little horn again. The 4th beast, verse 23, shall be the 4th kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdom, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saint of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. By the way, times and laws, if you look at other interpretation or explanation of these words in a concordance, it also means times, calendars, and laws. He thinks about changing the calendar. Now, let's continue. And this will be until a times and the dividing of times. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. So here I want to point to you something very important, that while this beast is taking over the power at this level here, there is hope, because that beast will also come to an end when the judgment are set and the books are open. That's almost a repetition, not quite the same, but repeating again. It says here very clearly that the judgment shall sit. So it's the same terminology if you look at verse 10, when it says the judgment was set. So now if we could point to the judgment that was set in the light of the beast, we could bring together more information. Well, it does not finish here. Let's turn to chapter 8 now. So we've seen chapter 2, chapter 7 with the beast. And something very interesting, now Daniel has another dream or vision, and he describes it as a vision in the 3rd year, verse 1, chapter 8, of the reign of King Belshazzar. A vision appeared unto me. So he had the first vision of himself, 1st year of Belshazzar, now he's having it on the 3rd year. So he's still under the Babylonian kingdom. Nothing to do with Media and Persia yet. And that which appeared unto me at the first. And here, this is where he has this dream. He was at Shushan, in the palace, in the province of Elam, and he was by the river Ulai. And there he saw something very fascinating, verse 3. He lifted up his head, and he saw, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram push westward, and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Well, if you push westward, northward, and southward, you're coming from the east. This is where this ram is coming from. So that no beast might stand before him, neither were there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. So, Daniel here is considering, and he saw a goat coming from the west. So we know the ram came from the east, the goat comes from the west, on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat has a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I saw standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground, and stamped upon him. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Now the goat was very great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and from it came up a notable one, 4 notable one, and towards the 4 winds of heaven. So you have the ram and the goat, and this is a battle now that implies, again, some animals, which we believe now to the prophecy of Daniel 7 that these animals are kingdom. And sure enough, let's go to the interpretation right away. Verse 20, it says, the ram which we saw having 2 horns are the king of Media and Persia. Remember when Daniel had this vision? It was still at the time of Belshazzar. And yet the Lord, through the angel, Gabriel, comes and interprets the dream or the vision and says this is Media and Persia. This is a prophecy to give us faith that God does reveal things in advance. And now, that being broken, whereas, verse 21, the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So you have the great horn, which is known as Alexander the Great. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So we know Egypt and Syria, Macedonia, and another one here that has been brought together. The 4 general of Alexander the Great took over, and they reigned for a while until the other horn that we're talking about here in this dream that he saw shall stand and took over the four kingdoms. Look at the little horn. Chapter 8, verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. And it waxed grace even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the star of the ground, and stamped upon them. And of course here we have another prophecy that takes place, where we hear about the daily, and we're told the word sacrifice was added by the interpreter, so we're not going to use the word sacrifice here. But Daniel is having a vision here, a heavenly vision, where he hears actually of a saint speaking, and another saint that says unto that certain saint which spakes, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, verse 13, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. And he says unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, if you read the rest of Daniel 8, Daniel fell sick, and he never received the interpretation at this time of the rest of the prophecy except for Media and Persia and except for Grecia. And remember now that these countries have continued to exist until the other country would take over. Notice that chapter 2 and chapter 7, we are still carried on with Babylon. But although Daniel had this vision under the Babylonian kingdom, in his dream or vision, there is no longer Babylon. Babylon is out of the picture now. If you follow me carefully, will you agree that chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8 are progressive? They progress through time, and this way we are not allowed to return back necessarily in the prophecy, because it progresses. It gives you the power, it gives you their character, and now it gives you how they progress through time. That's how the book of Daniel is written. That's how the book of Revelation is written. And the reason I'm saying that is because when you follow through with chapter 9 basically now will give you the interpretation of the rest of the prophecy of chapter 8, because that's how this book is written. Now, chapter 8 was the vision given under Babylon. But now, chapter 9, look when he received the interpretation. Verse 1, chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by book the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. We know from Jeremiah 25, verse 11 and 12, that Jeremiah had prophesied that the children of Israel would be 70 years in Babylon. This was coming to an end, even though Daniel now was very old. He had seen the whole realm of Babylon from Nebuchadnezzar and then his grandson Belshazzar. Now he's seeing Media and Persia taking over. He lived at that time, and not only that, he's also, according to the chapter on the lion's den which we saw, that Daniel was also under, this was under the Media and Persian kingdom, chapter 6, where Daniel was elevated as prime minister under Darius. If you look at chapter 6, verse 1, Daniel was chosen to be a prime minister because of his integrity. Now, chapter 9, we're going to bypass the wonderful prayer that Daniel does in order to be clear with God as he prays for himself and for his people. And then we come to verse 20. And this was at the time, we're told, of the evening sacrifice that will be in Jerusalem when the temple was still standing. And Daniel prayed. Remember, he prayed all hours of the day, but specifically at certain hours. And he prayed, and he was confessing his sin and the sin of his people. And then Gabriel comes and explained to him the vision. And this is where I believe we need to understand this, because that takes us now to William Miller. Let me tell you that in history, and according to Froom, this was not something new for the Millerite. Other interpreters of the Bible had already understood the book of Daniel 2 of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. This is not particular to the Millerite. Neither is the beast of Daniel 7. Neither is the beast of Daniel 8. But what is particular, because you can see that it's interpreted in the Bible already. But what's so interesting about now the upcoming era of 1798 with Daniel 7:25, where the beast has received a wound, the little horn, these are unclean animal. Did you notice that? These are unclean animal. But now chapter 8, where we have started to talk about the judgment was set and the book were open, now we're influenced like by thinking about the sanctuary. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And interestingly enough, these are the animals of the sanctuary, a ram and a goat. These are clean animals. Not that Middle Persia or Greece were necessarily clean, but the interpretation of the animals having to do with the sanctuary era is quite fascinating. So as Daniel now is receiving the second part of the vision of Daniel 8:14, we're going to be looking at where William Miller enters in. And William Miller enters in, if you allow me, I'm going to go for a few minutes now to 1798 era down to where basically we find William Miller and the interpretation of Daniel 8 and 9. This is where the Millerite comes in, is when we have now the interpretation of Daniel 8 and 9. Very fascinating indeed. So as we continue this study, we want to look at, after William Miller, 2 years period of intensive study of the prophecies from 1816 to 1818, he spent several years in reviewing and checking up this startling conclusion that the second advent of Christ was at hand.